Good afternoon, everyone out there in YouTube land. My name is Jared, and this is my channel, Mazda B3K. In this video, I'm going to swap out all 8 injectors on my 2001 Ford F250 with the 5.4 Triton 2 valve. Without further ado, let's get started. This came about because one day I was going down the road and suddenly didn't have a loss of power, but the truck began to emit a really foul smell, and what it was raw fuel. The engine was just dumping way too much fuel on one of the banks, and through some further investigation, it turned out to be I had a bad fuel injector on cylinder number 6, which is this guy right here on the driver's side. So I swapped that, and I had 4 injectors that worked. And I knew I had a problem on bank 1. I didn't know which one it was. Pretty sure it's number 6, but I swapped all 4 of these, and the truck began to behave like a brand new truck. It turned out, since I'd owned it, that I'd had at least 1 injector on bank 2, actually, which is the driver's side. And I swapped in those 4 as loaners. I wanted to get a full set of what are called flow matched injectors, which means that when they're spray tested and they're flow tested, that all 8 of them are pretty close to each other, within 5 to 10% as far as their flow rates. And what this does is gives you more consistent performance out of both banks. The computer has to do less work to adjust fuel trims, and things are just more consistent. Those finally came in a couple days ago, so I'm going to swap them out. If you've seen my coil and plug video, I had to remove the injectors as part of that, so you already know how to do this. However, if you've landed here from YouTube and you're just looking to do injectors, well, you're in luck, because we're about to do it. First things first, we need to make some room. That means the intake needs to come out. So remove this clamp. Remove this clamp. You may not have this. I think this is something custom to my vehicle. I wasn't the first owner. Remove this. And then remove up here. You don't need to unclamp this. You just need to remove up here. The whole thing comes out. Don't forget, you've got an electrical right here you have to remove as well. This is your IAT plus math. So get that loose. The whole assembly comes out. That's going to give us nice wide access to bank 2, which is the driver's side fuel injectors. Okay, next thing that needs to happen is we need to depressurize the fuel system. There is a Schrader valve here. It's going to be on bank 1, which is the passenger side. You're going to want to get something in here to press down on the valve core. Get the pressure out. Normally I can come at this more directly, but there's a bunch of junk in the way. Now, depending on how long your vehicle's been sitting and all that jazz, you may have a lot, you may have a little. It's going to spew some fuel. May be good to have a paper towel around you. So the system is now depressurized. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to lift up the locking rail on bank 2 back on the driver's side. So to lift this rail, we have 2 8mm bolts. If you've serviced this before, they shouldn't be terribly tight. If you have not, they could be quite tight. So you may have a fight on your hands, you may not. Anyway, we want to get these out. And once they're out, we can actually start removing fuel injectors from the fuel rail. And if you need to, you can also take the vacuum line off the fuel pressure regulator, which is this guy right here, if you need to. Give yourself some more working room. So, got one more after this. Make sure you do not lose this bolt. It's very important. Second one is all the way back here. At least for me, I use a step stool so I can reach back here without breaking stuff, without breaking me. I'm going to get that out, and then we're going to start lifting these injectors out. Okay, I've got the fuel pressure regulator unplugged. I've got both of these bolts out so we can kind of start lifting and rocking. Kind of get these up. So we got to disconnect them from their home in the lower intake, and also from the fuel rail. All right. Now I expect we also got to do the electrical, so just squeeze and disconnect there. That's not too tricky. Now, if you've depressurized the system, this hopefully won't fight you too hard. But then again, if this is the first time you're doing this kind of servicing, it may fight you hard. So be prepared for anything. All right, these are going to come out really easy because these are the 4 loaners I swapped in. You probably will have a little bit of gas spill. Some things to look for. Make sure when you take your old injector out, it's probably not going to be this clean, but that you have a seal up top, you have a seal at the bottom, and this plastic cap is also there. Very important. You need to have a cap, a seal at the bottom, seal at the top. If you don't have that, you've left pieces sitting there, and when you go to put your new injectors in, it's not going to work so well. So I'm going to get the rest of these out, and then I'll grab the new ones, and I'll show you what we got to do as prep before we put the new ones in. Okay, quick history lesson on injectors before we move on. I promise it'll be relevant. See how these all have a yellow top? So injector tops, it's not 100%, but you can use the color of the top to know the poundage of the injector. So if you see injectors that look like this and they have a yellow top, it means they are 19-pound injectors, which is what the 2-liter 5.4 came with from the factory. And these are good up to about 300 horsepower if you're doing go fast stuff, and then you got to switch to a heavier injector. Now, if you buy your replacement injectors from Ford right now, brand new Motorcraft 19-pound injector is pink. And also, not all 19-pound injectors look the same. I've got some 19-pound injectors for a 302 of mine that are this little skinny looking setup, not this one. This is like an older style. So, when you go to source your replacement injectors, make sure they're going to look a little something like this. If they're yellow top, that should work. If they're pink, that should also work, as long as they're sized to the vehicle. What I'm about to put in are remanufactured injectors. So they look just like this, yellow top, but the spray nozzles have been cleaned and replaced. The seal's been replaced. I think it's the pintile nets is what they're called. The little fine mesh nets that are inside the injector have been replaced, and they've been flow tested, which means someone stuck them on a bench, put power on them, and then ran gas through them and figured out how much they used and checked their spray pattern and all that good stuff. The seller I bought from, he will sell you a set of 8 that are flow matched within 10% of each other. And if you want it flow matched within, I think he said 1 to 5%, you got to pay more money, but he'll actually give you a piece of paper saying he did it. I guess that's for racing applications or something like that. Anyway, history lesson over. I'm going to put these in my stash. These are perfectly good injectors, and they save my bacon. So let's go roll out the new ones. All right, so there are my 8. So they all came individual bags. They have new seals, new pintile caps. That's what I was looking for, which is, I believe, this part right here. But they all match. They're all flow matched, more or less. These are remans. I highly recommend, if you can get someone with a core service, that you, even if it may cost you a little money, send your old injectors back to somebody, so that way they can be cleaned up, and then some other person who's looking to save some money can get this. I got this full set for $230, and if you look at Ford's website right now, I think they'll sell you one injector for it's like either $120, $150. So this is a massive savings. You know, this if you're the blue collar working man, this is what you want to do. So take your cores, your old injectors, send them back, get some new life breathed into them, so that another person down the line can use these instead of having to pay full price for brand new ones. So we got everything we need. See, this is it's a 4 nozzle. Look really close. I don't know if it'll do it or not, but there we go. There's 4 distinct spray nozzles. So anyway, we're gonna get these in, but before we do that, you don't want to put in the seal at the top and the bottom dry. You want to lube it down with some kind of oil. It doesn't really matter what you use as long as it's a thin coat. I'm going to use some PB. So you just a little PB. Make sure that's lubed up. Make sure this is lubed up. Just get your fingers wet. Rub the seal until you see a shine. And now you're good to install. One other thing before you install is if the injector wells are really nasty, you may want to clean those out first. Gosh, this camera. So that way you don't accidentally shove stuff into the cylinder when you put your fuel injector back in. But I'm going to go ahead and get those reinstalled, and then I'll show you how you need to make sure everything is properly seated. Alright, so we'll zoom in on injector number 5 here as an example. But what I did was thus. Firstly, I shoved the injector into its hole in the lower intake, which is the bottom. And sometimes you'll feel it kind of go pop when it goes in. Otherwise, you just kind of have to wiggle it into position and give it a couple of tugs to make sure that the seal has seated. And once you get all 4 in, then you bring down the fuel rail on top. Now you're going to have to push down in the front, and then also you're going to need to push down in the back. And you'll know that you got it when you can look at, let me move the camera a little bit. The TPS is in the way, but when you look at the fuel rail bolts, the ones that hold the rail in position, and they are perfectly lined up front and back in the same position that you saw when you took it off. That means that not only have you seated the bottom of the injector into the lower intake, you've seated the top of the injector into the fuel rail. And once you've done that, you can go ahead, take those 8mm bolts, send them back in, reconnect your electricals, and in fact, you could even put the air intake back on because you're done on this side. One side note, what I found for injector number 8, the one all the way in the back corner, is its power connection doesn't stick out towards the side being this way to the right if you're facing the firewall. It faces backwards towards the firewall, so you have to spin that injector around appropriately to plug it in. But otherwise, that's all you got to do, and then we'll move to the passenger side. Whoop, sorry. Oh, my poor tripod. Anyway, now we move on to bank 1, or the passenger side. Just give you the heads up, this side's harder. We've got more stuff in the way. We got a PCV valve we may need to move. There's just less room to work because you've got all of your HVAC stuff. That's your blower motor, that's your blower resistor, and that's your air box, and then here's part of your air conditioning, blah, 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 blah. So you have less room to work back there, but the setup is the same. You've got a fuel rail. You've got 2 8mm bolts on it. Get those bolts out, lift the rail, get the injectors out, make sure that all the pieces are there. Get your new injectors ready, shine up the seals with some kind of an oil so they don't go in dry. Get your injectors in, get the rail seated again, bolt it back up, make sure you do the electrical along the way, and you got it. You're just going to have less room to work. So since this is essentially the same as the driver's side, I will bring you in if there's something I feel that needs to be noted. Otherwise, I'm just going to get this knocked out, and then we'll do a conclusion and a test. Alright, so these are 4 of the original injectors on bank 1, and boy, they are rough. I'm not even sure how they were still firing, particularly this one here. It's really bad. Water got on there and it started to rust and it was going to town. So I'm not going to be able to return these for a core. These are too far gone. But yeah, it was definitely time for new injectors. Now notice 2 of these are missing their top seals. That means they're still stuck in the fuel rail. So what I'm going to do is I have a set of picks. One of them that's shaped like a shepherd's crook, which is kind of like the top of a question mark. And I'm going to use that and pull the O-ring out of it. Make sure that everything is clear to get these guys inserted. Another thing I may do is take a paper towel and try to wipe around where the injectors sit in the lower intake, because I imagine that it's full of rust crusties, because look at these seals. Fortunately, all the pin tile caps came back with. So, yeah, these are the original. This truck, as a reminder, if you haven't been following this truck on the channel, has 270,000 miles on it. So I think these were the originals. I'm going to get those caps out and then clean things up, and then we'll do reinstallation. Alright, so using my pick here, I have gotten these 2 seals out that were stuck in the hats, so that's fixed. I also used some flashlight work, and I checked that all 4 of the bores look okay, where the injectors are going to go into the lower intake, so I don't really need to do anything for cleaning. One thing I wanted to point out, a handy tool to have, an inspection mirror, particularly one that telescopes and has a hinge on it. You can get these at Harbor Freight for a couple of dollars, and they're really, really useful. That's what I use to track down where my 2 stuck seals were. I just got it under the fuel rail and checked each hole, make sure that the fuel rail looked pretty good, which it does, which makes sense because it constantly has fuel going through it. And again, random history fact of the day. Before the rise of the automobile, gasoline had been discovered, but nobody really used it. Kerosene got used for heating, but no one knew what to do with gasoline. So actually, its first main use was as a cleaning agent. So fuel was actually pretty good at cleaning stuff. Of course, that was before we developed the external combustion engine, the internal combustion engine. Anyway, so those look really clean. They should. We'll just go ahead and start putting in new injectors. Alrighty folks, after that fun little fight, everything is reinstalled. We've got all the seals we're supposed to have up here. Double check your work. Make sure you've reconnected all the injectors electrical. Make sure you've got those 2 8mm in. If you've got a cap on your fuel pressure valve, your Schrader, get that cap back on. Come over here and make sure you've reinstalled the intake. Don't forget the electrical right here. Otherwise your car will go bonkers when you turn it on. It kind of likes input from a math. Make sure you put, if you took it off, the vacuum line on the fuel pressure regulator, which is being most excellently blocked by this tube here. But there it is, right where my finger is. Make sure that's back on. Last thing we need to do is we're going to crank, we're going to run, and we're going to look really carefully, and we're going to listen for any fuel leaks, any injectors that maybe we didn't get seated quite right. And we need to check and be careful, because once the engine warms up, spraying fuel is a recipe for an engine fire. It's a great way to ruin your investment. So let's crank it up, then let's watch, and let's listen. Okay, I had this whole lovely segment about how things were looking fine when I checked the trims to see how the injectors were doing. Well, my stupid self left the PCV unplugged, which introduced a very large vacuum leak. So now that I have put that back in, the trims are acting completely different. You'll see it's actually it's taking fuel away. See how it's minus? And see how the numbers are really close to each other? So, completely different behavior now that the PCV valve is back in. I also see that it's kind of lugging a little bit. I'm not sure why. I still do need to drive it so the computer can relearn. Because one point I did make in my earlier clip is that even though this truck is supposed to be OBD2, because of its weight, at the time Ford only had to install the OBD1 system, and it's just not as good at computer control and diagnostics and things like that. So something to keep in mind. So I think the engine is kind of feeling its way through here. That's kind of interesting. It's pulling away a bunch of fuel from bank 1. That's the passenger side, and I can tell it's causing problems. And then bank 2, it's pretty neutral. It's actually causing the whole thing to buck. Hang on. Let's see what that does. Yeah, okay. I've seen the computer do that before. Whenever you change out injectors without a relearn, it gets kind of goofy until you drive it a bit and it learns. So, just going to keep an eye on it. Just another tool you can use to check things out with. One last thing you can do is, after you let it warm up and you're happy with the performance, turn it off and just listen. On my Ford Ranger, I had a case where the injectors weren't seated right because the fuel rail itself was actually bent, and you could hear a hiss drop as fuel was kind of cooking off because it wasn't where it needed to be. And you could listen in, and I isolated it and figured out it was the bent rail, straightened it out. Life was grand. So I don't hear anything that I shouldn't hear. This is what it always sounds like. So I'm going to call this a successful repair. I've got the new injectors in. I've got the old injectors out. It's a good thing they came out. And the engine bay is not on fire. So, good deal. Alright guys, that wraps up this episode for replacing fuel injectors on my 2001 Ford F250 with the Triton 5.4 2-valve. If you want to leave a comment, leave a comment. I like to read them, I like to learn from them, and I like to reply to them. If this video helped you, please like, share, and subscribe. That helps to grow the channel. And remember, I make the mistakes so you don't have to. I'll see you guys next episode.